So the way I think about this is I use this typology of kind of three primary forms of problem solving, right? Adversarial models, expert models, and deliberative models. And like all typologies, it just helps you think, right? And things probably don't fit into these kind of clearly. There's a lot of gray area. But the two dominant forms of talk are adversarial, right? Whether, again, we're talking about Democrats or Republicans, or we're talking about activist groups, or we're talking about all these kind of things, right? Most talk that we hear about tough issues is people that have a solution in their head, and their job is to mobilize other people, right? To try to convince other people to their side. Especially in a democratic society, hey, if we can get 51%, we can kind of pass things. You think about, passing a tough bill. Well, let's do this example. Say y'all are the political spectrums. You're far left and you're far right, right? If I'm someone on the left trying to pass a bill, who am I talking to? Who's my primary audience?
Us.
Okay. Well, no, I need to mobilize my base, right? Because they agree with me already, so I don't really need to convince them I'm right, but I need to make sure they show up, right? I need to make sure they put signs on their door and they bug their friends and that kind of stuff, right? So I got to mobilize my base. What kind of message works to mobilize my base? Probably saying bad things about you, right? And framing things in very simple ways, right? That we're good, they're evil, right? Then y'all are right. Then I need to mobilize the middle, right? I need to convince the middle wedge issues, get them on my side. Kind of same thing. What kind of communication does that spark, right? Now, most importantly, if I'm on the left and I'm trying to pass something, what do I say to you? Nothing.
Nothing.
Right? There's no reason. I know she's not going to vote for it, right? So I've given up on her. I just need to mobilize my base and go for the middle. So we've created a political system, right, that there's no reason for one side to really talk to the other side. They've given up on each other, right? And that's a very bad system in a sense. So that's the adversarial model, which is one of the dominant models. Then the other dominant model is the expert model. We're at a university, right? That problems are solved through data and through research and through rigor. And those are all wonderful things, right? The problem is both adversarial and expert work very badly with wicked problems. If the heart of the issue is underlining tensions and values, right? Adversarial is bad because you're inherently going to frame things away from that. You don't want to talk about tension. You're going to frame things, and it gives you, since there are underlying values that are in tension, it's very easy to frame it as good versus evil by just leaving some stuff out, right? And then expert, and the expert by definition know a whole bunch about a little bit, right? Experts are very good at systemic thinking. Right? If you go back to the water kind of frame, we have experts in all 9 of those boxes, but there's no expert that can tell us how to rank the boxes. Right? And so we need experts. We need experts to help us make, but experts can't make the decisions for us, right? They can help, they can improve the conversation. We need good data, deliberation, and especially a lot of the work that I do, we're really thinking hard now, trying to figure out how experts work and the role of experts in here. But it's the recognition that experts can't get us all the way home, right? So then deliberative, you throw the terms kind of tie with deliberative, which is all that we'll be talking about. Now, I will completely admit that when I kind of started thinking this way about 8 years ago, I fell in my own blinders that this is good and those two are bad, right? But then once I was actually doing the work in the community, I realized more and more how much I relied on adversarial and expert, right? I need experts, I need their data, but I also need the adversaries, right? I need the values, I need the passion. We need the pushback on the status quo, right? So in a way, when you do the deliberative well, you're bringing out the best in the other two and working to kind of avoid the worst in the other two. Mm-hmm. Right? It's how do we kind of do, bring that all together in a sense. Right? So a lot of the work that I do kind of combines, we need the experts, we need the data, we need the public, the advocates. One way to think about this is I kind of have a love-hate relationship with message boards. Right? So our local newspaper, every article automatically sets up a message. People can respond to it or whatever. You read those message board comments and they're horrible, right? They're just people just blaming each other and kind of framing very simplistically. So in some ways it's a horrible example of public discourse, but it's also very useful for me because I can see all the different sides, right? I can see what people are what values are important to people and how are they framing them. The problem is that's all that noise, and we need someone to make sense of the noise, and that doesn't happen naturally. So we'll get into that a little bit later with the Kahner model that I'll kind of explain is. But so we need all the noise, we need all the voices, but we need someone to make sense of those voices, to map those voices, and then think about how to work through those. And too often we just have the noise. So we need public, and then we need decision makers and politicians and the people with kind of the bigger levers of change in society. So democracy requires these three to work together well. And again, naturally, it's not happening. Right? So you'll see, I don't think I have it here yet, but I kind of exist here as a delivery practitioner, as being a translator, a mediator, right? Trying to kind of make this work in a sense as we go through. So I've got 2 slides here. I could spend all day on these. A lot of this kind of goes back to my old work of being a critic of public discourse. And so what happens when we have overly adversarial processes? I've already talked about this a little bit. The bottom line of this slide, from, again, my background in argumentation, my background is what's a good argument and those type of things. The bottom line is kind of somewhere in here in terms of the zero-sum game, that I really believe we have a system now that good arguments are punished and bad arguments are rewarded. If you frame things in simple ways, manipulative argument, to win an election, to pass a policy, to get popular. I teach studies of persuasion class, marketing, those type of things, and basically, we're selling ideas like we sell cereal and cars now, right? Of how do you frame this in the most strategically possible way? Maybe not out and out lying, sometimes out and out lying, but framing things that you get to pick the values in a way. Right? So that really kind of here, the zero-sum game is what I talk about, especially with a 2-party system. Anything good for one party is inherently bad for the other. And that causes a lot of problems. Right? That creates a really weird incentive structure to talk about tough issues. Right? Often, the reason we have so many negative ads is because blaming works better than expecting accountability, right? So most of our ads are kind of negative ads, and that's one of the things that transform when you have a better conversation, is that the conversation changes from who's to blame to what do we do now, and what's everyone's role. Plays in the flaws of human nature I've talked about a lot. I've got 3 kids. I've got a 13-year-old, an 11-year-old, and a 4-year-old. I watch a lot of Disney movies. Right? I've always wanted to write this paper. We have a lot of film critics in my department too, so I've always wanted to work with them. But they're changing now. There's some really interesting movies now, right? But the traditional Disney movie has always been good versus evil, right? And evil was like knowingly evil, just like a dark character that just had bad values, right? Yeah, and I think we were teaching all our kids that all tough issues are good versus evil, right? And you never feel the tension, right? And that again plays into human nature. But the more we start shifting that, and we realize, all tough issues, the issues look wicked, right? The heart of democracy, the heart of kind of community, is negotiating tensions and dealing with these things versus finding out who's good and who's evil. Right? I'm not saying there's not any evil, right? I'm saying most of the issues we deal with, that's not really the heart of it. So we need to kind of change the conversation. Privileges, organized, entrenched voices. This is huge for the work for local politics work, right, or local community work. Who is going to show up to that microphone at City Council? Who's going to write a letter to the editor, right? Who's going to start a Facebook page, right? The people, the entrenched voices, and I don't want to say extremists, right, but the people that are seeing things from one perspective. Right? That's the problem, is we do so much public 95% of our public process, public hearings or city council meetings or school board meetings, are horrible design from a communication perspective. Right? It's the one at a time on the microphone completely encourages bad quality communication. Right? What democracy requires, as we'll get into, is interaction, talking through these tough issues. And we don't do that. We don't have mechanisms to do that. So we're privileging the organized, entrenched voices. Those are the voices that are going to speak in a sense. Right? And we reward them for speaking out and framing things in simple ways. Right? And all of that causes polarization, cynicism, and apathy, and that creates a negative feedback loop. Right? And that's where we see a lot of our politics, is the other side kind of uses a manipulative strategy that justifies me using a manipulative strategy, that justifies them making an even more manipulative strategy, and it just kind of goes down. And the exciting fact about deliberative work is it creates a virtuous cycle. Right? That we're kind of changing that conversation, and as you do this process, it builds trust, and it builds skills, and it builds capacity. So a lot of the work that I'm doing in the CPD, it kind of builds on itself. And every meeting we do is a little bit easier because we have more and more people in our community that were part of the last project that understand, that are thinking that way, right? And we're starting to undo. It plays in the flaws of human nature, but the other kind of positive aspect about human nature is we can build up better habits. We can learn, right? So this process becomes a learning process for communities of how to think about tough issues. You're seeing that, in communities that have these strong centers, you're starting to see that impact in a way of change the way people think. It's so cool for me to see letters to the editor using terms that I'll be using today about working through and about wicked problems. It's because people have come to one project and it completely changed their, that's, we see aha moments all the time in our projects, right? That people are at a table going, that's why you think that way. They came in thinking this is an evil person. It's
really hard to sit across a table from someone and think they're evil, right? And they're telling their story and what's important to them, and all of a sudden you realize, and then they apply that to another topic. Something else jumps up, and their first reaction is, oh, good versus evil, and they think, wait a second, maybe this, they start thinking, what's the other perspective? What's the underlying intention here? And you build that habit. Yeah.
Okay, can you stop one?
Yeah.
I gotta change the battery.
Okay. I guess I'll take a breath. Am I going too fast? Or is okay?
I'm thinking about that one. The two extremes. I like this or I dislike this. And the modeling for this is so powerful that you see it everywhere. Even here at the university, you have the evaluations, and usually you get evaluations of the students who really like the class or really hate it.
Yeah.
So you just go these two extremes, and people, the one who don't have an opinion, they don't participate.
Yeah.
And you can see almost anywhere the environment is like that.
Yeah.
So with issues like Guantanamo Bay right now, so people who are debating that we close it, no, we leave it open, and the extremes also in everything. So it's like a learning behavior that we have now, and we use it for everything.
Yeah. I mean, and a way to think about this too, with the if you go back to the adversarial, the adversarial is kind of based on the metaphor of the marketplace of ideas. John Stuart Mill on Liberty, kind of chapter 2 is one of my favorite chapters to kind of engage students and makes the argument for free speech. But it's this assumption that let everyone talk. The best ideas will inherently win, right? The ideas closest to the truth, the ideas that have the most merit in a way. The problem is our marketplace isn't working, right? The loudest voices, the ones that speak, the ones that win aren't because they have a good argument, right? The ones that win because they have money, so they have the loudest voices or access to the larger audiences, or they're the most manipulative. They're very talented in how they frame issues. So one way to think about the work that we do is how do we improve the marketplace of ideas, right? And so it's not necessarily you get away from adversarial to do deliberative, and that's the connection between that. A lot of the work that I do is just try to get adversarial to work better, right? I try to get bad arguments to be exposed as bad arguments and good arguments to be elevated in a way, that have a little bit of quality. And that's easy to do in a classroom, right? Because I can grade them based on the quality of the argument, right? It's harder to do in the community because the way arguments are graded in the community is if they work or not, right? And there's a tension within argumentation between which arguments are ethical and effective. And it's easy to be effective, it's hard to be effective and ethical, right? But the more we create a community that understands argument, right? And understands kind of issues in this way, then you start changing that, right? And bad arguments start getting exposed. Or the simple fact of we're taking issues and developing background material and sparking conversation. As I develop background material, I can do a check. Bad arguments can get filtered out in a way. And I become a trusted source in my community because my goal is then to get them to think about which side's right. My goal is for them to have a good conversation, right? Well, to have a good conversation, they need good information, and that information needs to be exposed. Right. So then I start kind of changing that, and we start getting away from this polarized kind of
but then it also has to do with the way we operate now. We always operate now what is in there for me. Mm-hmm. And then we are not operating in a way what is good for the community,
Yep.
What is there for me. If it doesn't affect me, well, don't care.
No.
But if that affects me, especially economically, then I will go against or I would support that. But it's usually like that. And I don't know how we became like this, but it's pretty much what we have.
Yeah, well, and we'll get into that. I mean, so we'll talk about these 15 key aspects of deliberative perspective, and one of them is living in community. You're always going to be dealing with the tension between kind of individual, right, what I want, and what other people want in the common good, and that's the conversation that has to go on in a community. But that doesn't tend to, if it seems like it's everyone for themselves, then everyone's going to be certainly everyone for themselves. But once the conversation changes and it's a broader conversation, then it's a lot easier. And that's another one. I guess the good news from my experience of 10 years. Because a lot of economists in particular, political economists, will tell you like everyone is, interests don't change and everyone's kind of out for themselves. You spark a good conversation, you see that's not true. I see examples all the time of people supporting policies that don't help them.
but based on conversation with their neighbors and things like that, they realize the value of it in a way, right? You just need to create a culture and a community that makes sense in a way, right? As we kind of go through, right? Good? Yeah. So now we kind of switch to the drawbacks of expert-focused processes. Kind of the same thing. I deal a lot with experts, right? Most experts, when you say, yeah, we're going to engage the public more, cringe, right? Because the public tends to have lots of bad information, right? And experts get very frustrated. The one at a time on the microphone for a policy, it's clear that there's a lot of misinformation that gets kind of cycled through. But I kind of talk to the experts like, we're not doing more public engagement, we're doing better public engagement. We need to change it, right? So we need to negotiate kind of the role of the expert, the role of data in democracy in a lot of different ways. But really where I tend to kind of get the experts to agree with me is when they recognize that expert information is undermined in a polarized environment. Things are so polarized, the quality of conversation is so bad, that right now data is just ammunition, right? And each side just kind of, in complex issues, there's data everywhere. So, find some data somewhere and kind of use that, and just people kind of talk past each other, right? So data is not being used to inform the conversation. Data is just being used to kind of lob hand grenades to the other side. So experts recognize that we need to improve the quality of conversation, so data matters again. It's kind of the same thing. When you have an impartial source that's kind of helping run things, then data can play its appropriate role. Right? A couple of other things is experts can overemphasize what can be measured. One of the problems with expertise and data, I work a lot with nonprofits. There's such a move now to metrics and measuring and those type of things, and I'm trying to help them kind of modulate that a little bit, right? Because that bias in a sense that when you want rigor, when you want numbers, some things don't fit numbers very well, right? And some things are pretty hard to kind of define in some senses. So we want good data, but we also have to recognize that there's limitations of that. And inherently, any kind of policy issue, any kind of tough issue is going to be an interaction between facts and values. And we need to think about how do we talk about values. And values can't be measured, right? Values individually can't be measured in most cases. Value tensions kind of even complicate that a little bit more, right? So that's kind of a constant negotiation that we're dealing with, right?
Could you explain me, because I didn't understand why you think that if expert is, let's say, more or less neutral, why it's as a drawback? Why do you see this as a drawback?
Well, because expert, again, like I said earlier, experts going to be focused on one aspect, right? So they can provide us good data with it, but experts can't make the decisions for us, right? Because the decision inherently is going to be about negotiating between different values. So an expert can kind of tell us what is, an expert can kind of give us information if we do X, Y hopefully will happen, kind of cause and effect in a sense, but it's harder to kind of deal with the values in a sense. So experts can be neutral to the values, but policy decisions can't be neutral to the values. We have to engage values. So that's where, like one of the terms that's used sometimes is we need experts kind of on tap, not on top. We need experts there, we need good data, we need our decisions based on good data, but the data is not going to lead to the decision itself. Right? And the other aspect under, I mentioned earlier, but it's kind of on here, is data doesn't have a strong record in changing behavior. It's kind of that same notion that even if there's kind of a clear solution from the experts, the public's not just going to go along with that inherently, right? There's a lot of, especially in the United States, there's a lot of distrust of experts, right? Look at the vaccine kind of stuff, right? We can't just rely on experts. We can't advocate our responsibility to experts in some ways, right? But it's I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We'll kind of see how it comes through. Does that help a little bit?
No.
So here's the bottom line kind of the theory, and then we'll switch to kind of, okay, so what are the tools to actually kind of take on this? We face serious problems, right? There's a lot of different issues. Many do not have technical solutions, right? It involves behavior, those type of things, so it's not just a technical, scientific solution, because they involve these paradoxes and competing values. Facing them calls for collaboration, innovation, and our two dominant forms of talk, whether it's adversarial or kind of expert talk, are inadequate to kind of deal with these kind of problems, and often counterproductive, especially the adversarial are counterproductive because they create mistrust and frustration and polarization, which makes it harder for us to have a conversation.